what are the key failures or gaps you've observed in how international systems detect and respond to persistent genocide ideology? And how do you see a way to address these failings? Because at some point it just seems very endemic and intractable. What can be changed?
Thank you very much. And here we are commemorating the 31st, when we remember the genocide against the Tutsi. And it brings my mind to times at which the international community said never again. And we know that after the Second World War, how horrified everybody was, especially when the horrors of the Holocaust began to come out. And that led to the 1948 Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and the whole world saying, no, this can never happen again, and an outpouring of support for those efforts, with Ethiopia being the first country to ratify the Genocide Convention, with lots of legislation coming up in Latin America. And then we fast forward to the 1994, a genocide happened in this country against the Tutsi. A genocide happened in Srebrenica against the Bosniak Muslims. And again, we came to another never again moment where international mobilization in terms of what do we do to ensure that this never happens again. And I remember, because the genocide against the Tutsi, it's a genocide that happened in living memory. I personally had already graduated from the University of Nairobi, and I remember vividly what was happening at that time, and how it had been made very clear through early warning signs, especially by newspapers, journalists. They were writing, the Tutsis are being killed, the Tutsis are being targeted. So even those of us who didn't have information that the international organizations had at that time, that we knew that there was a genocide, there was something, there was massive mass killing. We didn't have the word genocide then, but we knew there was mass killing against the Tutsi. So the African Union put together legal frameworks in this never again moment to ensure that another genocide like happened against the Tutsi did not happen, put in place the ICGLR protocol with all these frameworks. The countries in the Great Lakes region are all supposed to have prevention of genocide committees that speak to ensuring that a genocide that happened against the Tutsi doesn't happen again. Europe has all these frameworks, the EU has frameworks. Many countries in Europe that already had Holocaust laws in terms of denying the Holocaust expanded them to speak to genocide prevention as well. But we are at a moment when we ask ourselves, so how good are these laws? How good are these legislative frameworks? When we can't speak to specific facts. And one specific fact being, and I'm glad that Florida worked at the ICTR, because one of the things that the ICTR did was indict more than 1,000 people. I don't remember the actual number. What I know is that more than 1,000 people are still living free. People indicted for the genocide against the Tutsi here in Rwanda. And that 500 of them, over 500 of them, 530 of them are living in the DRC. And if these people are living in the DRC, indicted by a UN tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and they are living free, what then does never again mean? Why aren't we all mobilized and trying to establish where those people are and trying to pressure the governments that are protecting them so that those people face trial? Why does the international community need to ask itself, like, you cannot condone living next to a bicycle thief, but you can condone living next to somebody who planned and implemented the killing of millions of people or thousands of people. So there is actually a failure in terms of implementation and in terms of what really needs to be done. So in terms of genocide ideology, we do know for a fact, those of us who worked in this field, that people who have been targeted for genocide before are 3 times higher at risk to be targeted again, which is why you see this genocide ideology going on and on, which is why we see that that when when the people who are being killed in DRC, you've seen the videos of people being burnt and eaten alive. So when a Congolese Tutsi says that they are being killed in the DRC, then you see the role of genocide ideology in that they blame the victim instead of blaming the people who are killing. We don't ask ourselves as an international community, do we actually think those 500, more than 500 indicted people went to the DRC and just sat there? Do we think that when they went there and found the Congolese Tutsi there, that they thought that now they'll start coexisting with them? Why do we not understand, why do we not address the root causes? And there's a failure of the international community of the fact of the existence of the FDLR. Why is there consistent overplaying, including international media, underplaying the role of the FDLR and saying the FDLR is not as powerful as it used to be? Why is it not powerful when it has an ideology and it has more than 500 people indicted by the ICTR who know how to actually execute a genocide and who are now living in that space? So in terms of frameworks, there's a lot that needs to be done. There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of political will. There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of knowledge, actual knowledge of genocide ideology. How many countries in the world are actually teaching genocide ideology? How many, each time when in my previous position, when I used to talk about risk factors for genocide, even to people who work within the international system, I would be surprised by how little people know. If you ask somebody, what are the risk factors for genocide in any specific space? What needs to be present for a genocide to happen? You'll be surprised how many little people know about that. So we may have laws, we may have frameworks, we may have policies, but in terms of implementation, we must ask the hard questions. And we must be prepared to ask hard questions of governments. We must be prepared to say that a life in Africa or a life in any other part of the world is as important as a life, for example, in Europe. We need to ensure that the international frameworks, the international human rights institutions speak to those specific lives as if one person, for example, had been killed, say, in Paris today. We need to speak to that particular aspect. So education still continues to be huge. It continues to be something that needs to be done, but what kind of education? And also we must stop framing never again as something episodic. You know, it comes and goes. Then we wait for the next genocide, then we are all running around and setting up tribunals and saying, no, this will never happen again, and then it happens again. Thank you.
How can the community come together? How can the community be harnessed as a force to address genocide ideology? Thinking about community, and community in the way it can be defined in so many ways, in terms of being small community, being a large community. I think in terms of genocide ideology, I think the 31st commemoration that we're having right now provides a very pivotal moment for Rwanda. And I'm thinking of Rwanda as a community among nations in the world. Rwanda that has been such a leader on so many aspects. For Rwanda to provide leadership, lead us in a global conversation on what do policy frameworks on genocide ideology look like. Because we have this assumption that people around the world do know what genocide ideology is, like all the nuances that both of you have spoken about, like they need to be really put out there so that people then see this from that perspective. And also in whatever communities people are in, religious communities, you know, if you are in political parties, whatever community you are in, I think very important to underline the fact that, you know, a genocide happened here in 1994, and that the UN General Assembly gave this genocide its proper name. And the name of this genocide is a genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. So important to pass this information to communities that we all are in
if you are in a trade unionist community, if you are in a teachers community, to explain to everyone that if the Tutsi were not targeted for destruction in whole or in part in this country, that then no Hutu moderate would have been killed, no peacekeeper would have been killed. They were killed because the peacekeepers, the Hutu moderates, anyone who was not Tutsi, was killed because they were standing in the way of the complete annihilation of the Tutsi community. So if you're still using the words Rwandan genocide in official communication, in whatever you are doing, in normal conversation, then know that you are speaking the language of the perpetrator, you are speaking the language of the denier. So it's absolutely important that we call this genocide for what it is. If we are to speak to our humanity, the humanity that made us all say never again, and we hope this never happens anywhere again, and we know it happens again, let's call what happened, what happened. We call the Holocaust, we must call this genocide by its proper name. Its proper name is a genocide that happened against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And then in terms of communities as well, thinking of what is going on, for example, in this genocide ideology that is spreading, we are not looking at the bigger picture of artificial intelligence. What does it mean when all these false narratives keep being put out? When all these media houses, very strong media houses, are putting out false narratives on exactly what is happening? What does it mean when, again, we start blaming victims for what happened to them? What then does it mean for artificial intelligence? It means that artificial intelligence will pick up those lies, and before we know it, then this will be considered as the truth. So we have to be very, 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 we have to form a community amongst ourselves in terms of ensuring that the right ideology goes out, and that's not the genocide ideology, it's the fact of what exactly happened in this country. You know, in my previous occupation, in my previous position, I engaged a lot with the communities in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the genocide deniers of Srebrenica borrowed from the Holocaust deniers. And the genocide deniers of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, they also borrow from Holocaust deniers. Look at the arguments that they make that Florida has outlined about numbers, about where, you know, all those kind of things, and you see the similarities. And so, really, we must come together as a community that understands what genocides do, and that genocides are specifically targeted to specific people, and that those people are not targeted because they are deserving of genocide, but it's because this ideology has been built against them. So we must understand that there are people who wake up every day, and what they are just putting out is denial. They are putting out inversion. They are trivializing the genocide. So we have all the legal frameworks that we've mentioned about. The African Union's Constitutive Act is very clear in terms of prevention of genocide. We have the ICGLR protocols that I mentioned earlier that require that every country in the Great Lakes region must have a committee to prevent genocide. We have all these laws and legislations. The UN, you know, all these international bodies have all these laws. However, we must put it to ourselves as communities in terms of how do we make all this operational? How do we make this, how do we make this come down to the ground? And then, very important, because we are here for the 31st commemoration, very important that we speak to one of the places where the ideology is so prominent, and of course I'm speaking about the DRC. It's extremely important, and Florida, you know, when you say that young people are now the ones who are being involved in genocide denial, how much do these young people know in terms of facts? Because we have to counter, we know the way the circle of socialization works. When a young child is growing up, they get their information from their families, And unless that information is countered by schools, is countered by media institutions, is countered in other spaces, they will continue going on with this information. We must speak to the fact that when a genocide happened here in 1994, that there was a huge refugee movement to DRC, and that in that refugee movement, there were quite a number of people who had participated in killing people here, who had participated in the genocide. And those people haven't been brought to account. We must speak to that. We must also speak to the fact that M23 did not exist before the 1994 genocide. That M23 began to exist when this mass movement of people went there. Among them, the 500 people who are then to be indicted, over 500 people who are then to be indicted by the ICTR, and that's when the M23 was formed. We must speak to the fact that the focus on M23 is huge and immense, yet there are more than 130 armed groups in the Kivus. Why do we not speak to those 130 or more than 100 armed groups in the Kivu? Who is benefiting from this narrative that focuses on M23? And we must also speak to the fact and not be afraid of the truth, because the truth is also that among those more than 100 armed groups, M23 is the only one that is fighting for survival. It's the only group that is fighting against an ideology. There are no other ideologies against these other armed groups. So unless we ensure that we speak facts, then it becomes almost impossible to counter what we are seeing in front of us. And so then that brings me to, what did Rwanda do when the world abandoned Rwanda to itself? Rwanda reached into itself and had conversations with itself and decided we actually had homegrown methods that could work in the current situation. We don't have to wait for somebody else to come in. So all these homegrown methods came up, and they are so impressive in terms of how to deal with each particular situation. And the video that we saw when we first came in spoke to some of those homegrown methods. And so then, now I'm speaking to the African Union, I'm speaking to the East African community, and I'm asking, when do we look into these homegrown methods of sorting out some of these issues? Because these homegrown methods will also speak to the larger problems, and the larger problems include the fact that if you go to the Kivus today, or to much of Africa, you'll find weapons that not even national armies have. Where are these weapons coming from? We know that there is an existing willing seller, willing buyer market for these weapons in this continent, but we must speak to the fact of who is arming these armed groups, who is benefiting from armed groups being armed. So we must speak to those facts. So speaking to a community approach, we are speaking to looking into ourselves and thinking. So we've been looking out to the world and trying to get solutions for what is going on. We've been trying as much as possible to bring out the issues that are happening. We've been trying to bring out these narratives, and when I say we, I'm speaking about the fact that even I, in my previous position, the things I'm saying now, I said them. I used to put out statements and say, this is what is happening. But then, the larger aspect of that speaks against the truth, that is what we must speak against, because we really must tell the truth. And let's never again means nothing. We must tell the truth. And as I said earlier, that communities who've already been targeted for genocide are 3 times likely to be targeted again. The stereotypes exist. You've heard the explanation that if you stand on a street in Europe and talk about cockroaches, nobody will understand. But those who are being called to action will understand that this is the moment to go again for a community that's been targeted for genocide. So we must reach into ourselves. This is the year 2025. We must remember what it felt like after the genocide in 1994 and ask ourselves honestly, what is it that made those who do not speak for the Tutsi today not speak for them? Really ask yourself that question. Really ask your governments that question. Really ask your governments, what is this that makes it possible to stand with perpetrators of genocide? Why would any government stand with perpetrators of genocide? So, and of course, I end by saying what I began by saying in the beginning, that if your government is protecting genocide perpetrators, it's absolutely important to ask the question, why are we protecting genocide perpetrators? People who have been indicted by an international criminal tribunal, why are we protecting them? And they are all over the world. So I've spoken specifically about the over 530 in DRC. There are many others in many other countries. And we must really, really, really ask of ourselves questions. How meaningful can the 31st commemoration of the genocide against the Tutsi be if we cannot speak to the fact that we have allowed perpetrators to live free, we have allowed perpetrators to continue the genocide ideology, we have allowed narratives that are completely false to be put out against a victim community. Thank you.